Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're starting Chapter 32, The Building of Global Empires. Well, even under the best of circumstances, campaigns to conquer foreign lands have always been dangerous and very expensive. They come from a sense of foreign conquest is actually essential to a government, and they use things like mobilization of political, military, and economic resources as being important to that goal. In the 19th century, in 19th century Europe, proponents of empire advanced a variety of political, economic, and cultural arguments to justify the conquest and the control of foreign lands. The imperialist ventures they promoted enjoyed dramatic success, partly because of the increasingly sophisticated technologies developed by European industry. Now, aided by powerful technologies, European states launched an unprecedented round of empire building in the second half of the 19th century, which we often call the Age of Imperialism. Imperial expansion began with the British conquest of India. Competition between imperial powers led to European intrusions into Central Asia and the establishment of colonies in Southeast Asia. Fearful that rivals might gain control over some region currently free of imperial control, European states embarked on a campaign of frenzied expansion in the 1880s that brought almost all of Africa and Pacific Ocean territories into their empire. 19th century imperialism was mostly a European affair. Toward the end of the century, however, two new imperial powers appeared on the world stage, the United States and Japan. Both lands experienced rapid industrialization in the late 19th century, and both built powerful armed forces. As European imperial powers planted their flags throughout the world, leaders of the United States and Japan decided they too needed to establish a global imperial presence. Imperialism and colonialism profoundly influenced the development of world history. In some ways, they tightened the links between the world's people. Trade and migration increased dramatically as imperial powers exploited the resources of subject lands and recruited labor forces to work in the colonies throughout the world. Yet imperialism and colonialism also brought people into conflict and heightened sense of differences between people. European, Euro-American, and Japanese imperialists all came to think of themselves as superior to the people they overcame. Meanwhile, foreign intrusion stimulated the development of national identities in the colonized land. And over time, these national identities served as a foundation for anti-colonial independence movements. The idea of imperialism dates back to the 19th century, and by 1880s it was in popular discourse. Later we talk about military imperialism and much later economic and cultural varieties of imperialism, and then the last one is going to be the U.S. imperialism along with Japan. So what are the motivations for imperialism? But there's quite a few. Economic is probably the main motivation. Governments and private companies under those governments were looking for ways to maximize profits. So economic expansion demanded cheap labor, access to or control of markets to sell or buy products, and natural resources such as precious metals and land, and governments had to meet these resources. There's another reason why, though: exploration. Imperial nations or their citizens wanted to explore territory that was to them unknown. Sometimes they did this for the purpose of medical or scientific research. At other times, they did it for just the sense of adventure. Invariably, imperial explorers sought to discover, map, and claim territory before their imperial competition could do it, and partly for national and personal glory, and partly to serve the imperialist goals of expansion. There's another reason: ethnocentric reasons. Imperial nations sometimes believed that their cultural values or beliefs were superior to other nations or groups. Imperial conquest, they believed, would bring successful culture to inferior people. That's the noblesse oblige excuse. In the late 19th century, for example, European powers clung to the racist belief that inferior races should be conquered in order to civilize them. The Europeans acted on their own ethnocentrism, the belief that one's race or nation is superior to others. There were political reasons also. Patriotism and growing imperial power spurred countries to compete with other countries for supremacy. It's a matter of national pride, prestige, and security. Empires sought strategic territory to ensure access for their navies and armies around the world. The empire must be defended, and better yet, expanded. Political motives were often triggered as responses to maybe perceived threats to security or prestige of the imperial power or its citizens abroad. And the last one I want to touch on here is religious. During the imperial expansion, religious people sometimes set out to convert new members of their religion and thus their empire. Christian missionaries from Europe, for example, established churches in conquered territories during the 19th century. In doing so, they also spread Western cultural values. Typically, missionaries spread the imperial nation's language through the education and religious interactions. Although some missionaries helped to preserve indigenous languages, British missionaries led the charge to stop the slave trade in the 19th century, while others, such as the French missionaries in Vietnam during that same period, clamored for their country to take over a nation. There are two things that you need to remember about manifest destiny. First off, manifest destiny was believed to be predetermined by God, whereas imperialism had no reference to destiny or God at all. Secondly, manifest destiny dealt only with the North American continent, but imperialism was the expansion of the US, Europe, and Asia into other territories. So the white man's burden, that was another one of the motivations. Rudyard Kipling wrote a verse about the white man's burden in, between 1864 and 1936. And what he talked about in that poem was the duty of the white man to bring order and to bring enlightenment to distant lands, and to bring religion and to bring civilization, because the thought was that these other people in other lands were uncivilized and needed to be saved, basically. There were some advancements in European and American technology that allowed for the imperialist powers to gain control much easily over the places that they colonized and the people that they colonized. The steam-powered gunboat, the use of medicinal science, and the discovery of quinine made imperialism actually powerful. The gunboat penetrated African rivers, and quinine made it possible to reduce the deaths associated with tropical diseases, especially malaria and yellow fever. And the United States also utilized gunboats throughout the Pacific and in the Americas. And the construction of the Panama Canal was possible only after Walter Reed and George Washington Goethals had cured the yellow fever. So following the explorer were the missionary doctors and the merchants, who soon were necessary for the soldier and the colonial administrator, who saw the use of steamships in construction of canals like the Suez and the Panama, and the laying of submarine telegraph cables, and the building of railroads to bind an empire together. Infrastructure was important. It also forced the imperialist powers to acquire lands that could facilitate the movement of steamships and the linking of cables and the building of canals. You couldn't just stop in one place. You had to continue on so you could continue to link that canal and that cable on to another country. The revolution in firearms, especially the Maxim gun, gave Europeans and Americans and Russians and Japanese an overwhelming advantage against colonial peoples. No matter whose imperial nations fought, they had the Maxim gun. The Zulus, the Indians, the Vietnamese, the Sudanese, the Arabs, the Burmese, the Africans, the Filipinos. Advanced weaponry made victory possible over all of these peoples. Along the Congo River, Henry Stanley and a few gunboats and machine guns and 1,000 rifles and 2,000 men created the Congo Free State, a state larger than all European nations except Russia. Advancements in communication became very important, and communication and technology. In the 1830s, sending a letter from Britain to India or backwards took as long as 2 years. After they built the Suez Canal, it only took 2 weeks. The telegraph was another very important thing, and that laying of the submarine cables under the ocean was very important also. Now Britain and India could communicate with each other within 5 hours. This ends the section 1 of chapter 32.